Thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause to wonderful performers. Thank you. As folks continue to come in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get the program started. How is everyone doing this morning? All right. Welcome to the University of Florida, and welcome to From Segregation to Black Lives Matter, a national symposium and celebration of the opening of the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American History at the University of Florida. Welcome to all who traveled near and far to be with us for this momentous three-day event. My name is Paul Ortiz. I am an associate professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, known by our friends and community as SPOP. You'll hear that term a lot, SPOP, and so that's us, the Proctor Program. We're going to be welcomed in a few moments by some amazing people. However, I want to take this opportunity to direct your attention to our print program, if you will, and just a few administrative matters. First, on the page after the map page, you will see the territorial acknowledgement, and please take a moment to read over this narrative. It is important for all of us to remember that the University of Florida is located on Native American indigenous lands. In fact, one body of the narratives located within the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History is a collection of interviews that SPOP conducted in the summer of 2012 with descendants of the African Seminole people of Florida. Their ancestors fought for freedom against the United States government during the three Seminole Wars during the 1800s. Professor Larry Rivers, who's sitting in the front row from Florida A&M, has written a wonderful book on this struggle. Their descendants, over a century later, traveled to St. Augustine in the summer of 2012 as part of a National Park Service project to reconceive the idea of the Underground Railroad during slavery. When we usually think of the Underground Railroad, we think of Canada, right? We think of going north, but as many African Americans escaped for freedom to Mexico, to the Bahamas, to Latin America. So we were able to interview some of the remarkable ancestors of their forebears who escaped to Mexico, to the Bahamas, and other parts of Latin America in the 1840s. So tomorrow, when the Dean of Smathers Libraries, Judy Russell, and her staff unveil the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History, these stories of endurance, struggle, and triumph will be accessible worldwide to students, scholars, and members of the global public. And as we gather for this three-day symposium, a few other administrative matters. First, restrooms are available right outside the doorway that you entered. If you have any questions about how to get around the building or the campus, please ask a SPOP staff member. They can be identified by our very attractive lanyards and name tags. And SPOP staff, raise your hands for folks. Okay, so we'll be circulating around. Any questions, please feel free to approach us. Now, there will also be a courtesy shuttle available during our lunchtime break, which is available to Midtown restaurants nearby. And the shuttle will be running between here and the North Lawn free parking area throughout the day. And again, if you have a question about how to get to the shuttle, just let one of our staff people know. So the symposium has been made possible by the labor and support of scores of people and units on campus. Before I ask President Fox to give his welcoming remarks, please join me in turning to page 32 in your print program, because some acknowledgments are in order. And we have the free parking today. We've been able to collect these oral histories. We've been able to train generations of students because of this amazing institutional support. And if you just take a moment to look at this list of co-sponsors, this is the community that came together to really make this program possible. So let's give our co-sponsors a round of applause. And finally, I want to point your attention to the tables in the lobby. We're blessed at this gathering with an august assembly of historians and authors. Today and tomorrow, we have many of their books for sale. Thanks to the UF Bookstore, and I don't know about you, but I'm going to be buying some books and getting some signatures. so please feel free to partake. Now I would like to ask the president of the University of Florida, Dr. Kent Fox, to join me at the podium. And President Fox has some words of welcome and encouragement for us. Dr. Fox.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it really is a privilege to be with you all for such an important symposium and celebration. And I want to give, on behalf of the administration, a warm welcome to all of our guests from across campus, across Gainesville, across the state, and literally from across the nation. Welcome to the University of Florida and to this symposium. Although I've only been here slightly more than 4 years, I believe this is one of the largest and most significant events dedicated to African American history ever held at the University of Florida. And it's indeed so good to have so many students from across our campus, as well as scholars, community members, activists, and leaders, and a few history makers here in our audience. I want to thank also our university's provost, Joe Glover, and for his office sponsoring this event, and for his office's support of the African American History Project in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. And I'm also really, really grateful and proud of Professor Paul Ortiz, who's the director of the Proctor Program, for long serving as the prime mover in this effort. Thank you, Paul. And finally, I want to commend all of the students and others who have volunteered thousands of hours in interviewing peoples whose voices and stories, often unheard in their lifetimes, can now be forever heard. So one of the highlights of the upcoming 3 days of lectures, discussions, film premieres, and more is the official unveiling of the Joel Buchanan African American Oral History Archive. Now, I never got to meet Mr. Buchanan. He was one of the first students to integrate Gainesville High School and a local educator and historian of our African American community. But I was privileged in early 2015 to see a play, Gator Tales, which is based on his oral history, as well as those of some of the pioneering African American students at our university and others active in the civil rights here in our state of Florida. It was only my second month as president, so I was very new to the history of our university, the state, our community, and to the stories of the people who lived that history. But the words, powerfully conveyed by actors and actresses from the School of Theater and Dance, moved me and informed me. I learned of how the first African American students at our university were often shunned by other students and faculty. I also learned of their strength and their sense of purpose, their conviction that while what they were doing was hard, it was necessary. I learned of what daily life was like in our city of Gainesville. For example, how African American residents could not get financing to buy homes. You're scheduled to see a film version of Gator Tales, and I suspect you will also find it powerful. The play's oral histories represent just a handful of the more than 600 oral histories in the Buchanan collection. Indeed, the collection reflects African American life as it was lived throughout the 20th century, including interviews with veterans of both world wars, those who resisted segregation, people active in the civil rights movement, and people with family stories passed down directly from slavery, even descendants of the survivors of the Second Seminole War. Spanning all of Florida and the civil rights activists in the Mississippi Delta, the collection is one of the largest and the most significant regional collections of black oral histories in the entire nation. My March column in our student newspaper, The Alligator, discussed today's symposium, and in that column I noted that the civil rights era oral histories helped me grasp the high personal cost of achieving change and the sacrifice of individuals who blaze that trail. And by the same token, though, I think these oral histories make clear why such a sacrifice is worth making. Indeed, there's no better inspiration for our continued civic engagement, our active participation in democracy, than the accounts of the African American pioneers in the Buchanan Archive. These are the stories of our best citizens and our truest patriots. And I'm thankful that we're always going to have those stories in this collection to inspire future generations after we are long gone. To inspire them in their struggles, paraphrasing Dr. Martin Luther King, as, quote, to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. With that, it is now my privilege to turn the microphone over to our university's provost, Joe Glover. Joe?
Thank you, Kent. I would also like to join President Fox in welcoming the honored guests, the faculty, and the students attending this wonderful event. One of the most important things that makes civilization possible is the opportunity to tell our children about our life experiences. If we are lucky, we also get to tell our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. But seldom have our voices been heard by great-great-grandchildren and by subsequent generations. Our voices actually tend to fade away relatively quickly, and with them fade vivid memories of the struggles and triumphs that shape individual lives, the communities in which they live, their culture, and society at large. It is important that these memories persist, particularly for the African American community, whose journey has been a singular one in 20th century and 21st century America. The technology now exists to preserve these voices for future generations. The pioneering work of the faculty, staff, and students of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program are ensuring that we will be able to learn for generations about the experiences of African Americans from their very own narratives and in their very own voices. I am proud of the work of the program, as is the entire university, since it is built and houses a resource unique in the United States. I would especially like to recognize the work of the director, Dr. Paul Ortiz, who has been the steady hand behind this monumental project and to whom a lot of credit is due. And thank you all for giving me the opportunity to join you this morning in celebration of the opening of the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American History at the University of Florida. I celebrate not only the opening of the archive, but also your gathering in this symposium to help outline the future of this ambitious project. Thank you, and best wishes on this project.
Thank you so much, Provost Glover and President Fox. We have been blessed throughout the entire history of the African American History Project by sterling support, both moral support and, should I also mention, financial support from the Office of the Provost and the Office of the President. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to turn the mic over to my dear colleague, Professor Sharon Austin, in a moment, but I also wanted to acknowledge two very important individuals this morning, one of whom we are going to hear from in a few minutes. This event is about history, community, and family. And we're here, above all, to remember a remarkable person who really was the catalyst for this entire research project. How many of you, just a show of hands, knew Joel Buchanan? So we're family, right? He was a person who brought us together, right, over and over again. Mr. Buchanan was a person who told us some very tough stories, as Dr. Fox mentioned, in Seeing Gator Tales. Joel Buchanan was really the individual, along with Dr. Samuel Proctor in the 1980s, who started a project called Fifth Avenue Blacks. And in that project, Mr. Buchanan conducted scores of oral history interviews with African American residents of Gainesville and Alachua County. This morning, I also want to recognize two members of the family of Joel Buchanan, Rita Buchanan and Unita Buchanan. Please join me in acknowledging the family members. Now I would like to ask my dear colleague, Professor Sharon Austin, to provide us some words of welcome and wisdom. Dr. Austin is director of the African American Studies program. That program, by the way, graduates over 100 students per year, African American Studies majors. So let's welcome her with a round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to just tell you a little bit more about Joel Buchanan, and then also I want to show you a clip from an interview that was conducted with him a few years ago on the SPOP website. It's always an honor and a pleasure to work with Paul Ortiz and also to work with the students in SPOP. I've been working with them for several years. And one of the things that we do in my African American Studies senior seminar is analyze some of the oral histories, because so many of our students are unfamiliar with people like Joel Buchanan and the contribution that they made. So I want to tell you a little bit more about him. Joel Marcus Buchanan was the foremost authority on black history in Gainesville and Alachua County. And it's my honor, and also the honor of Dr. Ortiz and everyone here today, to formally honor him by talking about the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History that we are now in the process of unveiling, which will be unveiled tomorrow. He was born on July 31st, 1948, to Joe Buchanan and Gussie Williams Buchanan. He was the first black male student to attend Gainesville High School in 1964, when he and two black female students, Sandra Williams Cummings and LaVon Wright Bracey, crossed the segregated school line in Alachua County. In 1966, Buchanan graduated from Gainesville High School with honors and went on to graduate in the early 1970s from the University of Florida with a bachelor's degree. He also earned a master's degree here at UF. He retired in 2010 as a history liaison at the UF Smathers Library Special Collections Department after a professional career that included stints as a teacher at Howard Bishop Middle School and Santa Fe College. He also worked in the UF Financial Aid Office. Buchanan is best known for his contributions to preserving black history in Gainesville and Alachua County. He organized an exhibit at Smathers Library that featured the late A. Quinn Jones, a legendary Alachua County educator who was the principal at former all-black Lincoln High School from its creation in the 1920s until he retired in the 1950s. Mr. Buchanan was instrumental in procuring black archival material for Smathers Library. He received these materials and also contributed to the Visionaires Incorporated of Gainesville, which is a local civic social organization for black women, and also from Dr. Edgar Cosby, who in 1950 became the first black dentist to open a practice in Gainesville. So that tells you just a little bit about who Joel Buchanan was. And now I want to play a clip, and you can find this on the SPOP website, from the African American History Project, from an interview with him that was conducted a few years ago. Okay, I'll just... Doing this right, Paul? It's not working though. It's supposed to be. It was last night when I looked at this. Is it frozen? Where's Stephanie? Stephanie Birch. It's yours. But even if, okay. Okay, well, I'll just describe a little bit. You can look at it on your own, because this is the link from the oral history page and the African American History Project. But it basically is an interview with him that's very good, that my students and I listened to in my seminar class. And in the interview, he talks about exactly what it was like being the first black student at Gainesville High School, and what the types of experiences that he dealt with. And also in Gator Tales, which was mentioned earlier, it was also shown just about his experiences and about the way he was treated there, and also the way that he was treated here at UF. So I know that it probably isn't working right now, but later on, if you want to listen to an actual interview with him, and also if you go to this same website, there are interviews with a lot of other people who made a significant contribution to not only to Gainesville and to Alachua County, but also to the University of Florida. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. And we'll try to get this up and to show it a bit later today. It's a really powerful clip, and I just want to echo what Dr. Austin said. These interviews, these oral history interviews, have been put to work quite extensively for students in our community, on our campus. Students at Santa Fe College have used them. We've been able to share them already with high school teachers and students throughout the state of Florida. What makes this event special is that starting tomorrow, we'll be able to share the interviews with people not only here in our local community, but throughout the entire globe. And we're so thrilled. We're getting calls now, and Ryan Marini, our Associate Director, and Tamara Jenkins, our Office Manager, can echo me in this on a daily basis from colleagues in the West Coast, from the Northeast, from Europe, from Latin America, asking us when these interviews are going to be accessible. So someone has let the word out. Okay, so that's really good. And people should know this because African American history in Florida is a local, it's a regional history, and it is also an international history. So now it is my great honor to be able to turn the microphone over to Rita Buchanan, who has graced us with her presence today. She's the niece and goddaughter of Joseph Joel Buchanan. She graduated from Gainesville High School in 1990, Santa Fe College in 2007, and will graduate from University of Central Florida in the fall of 2019. Ms. Buchanan has been a soccer coach with Youth Soccer Incorporated for 16 years. She has been the vice chairman of the YSI Board of Directors for 4 years and is currently working at Meridian Behavioral Health Care as the Senior Executive Assistant to the Chief Clinical Officer. Please join me in welcoming Rita Buchanan.
Good morning. Maya Angelou said, "You can't know where you're going until you know where you've been." Joel's passion was just that, for knowledge of what his ancestors went through so that history wouldn't repeat itself, and so that generations to come could do better, be better, and strive for better. It is through his own account of living during the time of segregation and his experience during integration that fueled his passion to know more and do more to promote change and a better life. Life not only for his family, but people within his community, his city, and anyone who he came in contact with. This passion was shown throughout his life and displayed through his collecting of more than 50 oral histories from African Americans who lived in a time before him and during the time a change occurred. And it is the reason that we are all gathered here today. We, the family of Joseph Joel Marcus Buchanan, are honored that the University of Florida, along with the Smathers Libraries and Dr. Paul Ortiz and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, thought enough of Joel's hard work and effort to honor him in this magnitude. We say thank you. Over the next few days, you will have the opportunity to take a glimpse and, in a way, experience Joel's passion for the history of African Americans through panels, films, exhibits, performances, and lectures. We, the family, welcome you to the African American Oral Symposium, From Segregation to Black Lives Matter, a symposium in celebration of the opening of my uncle's archives, the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History at the University of Florida. Thank you.
In thinking this morning about Joel Buchanan, I was taken back to the summer that I first arrived at the University of Florida. I was not then a professor or a director. I was a graduate student, completely unknown in this community. And somehow, somewhere, someone made sure that I spoke with Joel Buchanan, your uncle. And he didn't know me from Adam. That's an old phrase, right? But it's really true. And he immediately adopted me to teach me history. Now, does that story sound familiar? Because I didn't know it at the time, but I learned later that I was only the latest of Joel Buchanan's adopted historian apprentices, right? And within a few days, he had taken me to Porter's neighborhood, to many different neighborhoods. He took me out to the county. He took me to Jonesville. He really made sure that I talked to a lot of people in Alachua County about African American history. And as I got to know his story, I really began to appreciate not just the energy, but the passion, the intelligence, the incredible creativity that Joel Buchanan exercised everywhere he went in really bringing people together, in making this community a better place, in bridging campus and community. We talk a lot about that concept, the town and gown divide. It exists on every campus and every community in the United States, but very few communities are lucky enough to have a Joel Buchanan, right? And I remember, this is not going to be politically correct, but I remember when I first met Joel Buchanan back in the day when people still smoked. Remember that day? And he would sit on the outside of Smathers libraries and take smoke breaks with his colleagues, other librarians. And just to have that opportunity to hear him tell stories about the history of UF, the history of Gainesville, kind of those unspoken hidden histories, right? I know you know what I'm talking about. It was so exciting. And I would kind of tarry a little bit, and people would say, Paul, aren't you supposed to be in the archive, in the reading room? And I would say, well, the real history is outside, in the break room, in the break area. And it was just an incredible, wonderful experience. And we're actually going to close out the welcoming in just a few moments, but I do want us to take a moment to think about the wonderful narrators or interviewees, the people that Joel Buchanan interviewed in the 1980s, the people who he introduced us to in the 2000s. Many of the people in our collection have passed on, but their stories are going to live forever. And the reason they're going to live forever, number one, is Joel Buchanan made sure this was the case. He made sure that we remember that African American history is at the center of this state's narrative, state's history. It's at the center of U.S. American history as well. I wanted to tell you real briefly the story about how we got the African American History Project started many years later in 2008 because it also involves Provost Glover. It involves Marna Weston, who's sitting right here. Everyone knows Marna, by the way, right? Let's give Marna a warm round of applause, because Marna remembers when the three of us, Joel Buchanan, Marna, and myself, sat together and spent hours under Joel Buchanan's leadership to think about how to put together a new kind of research project that would be community-based, that would also have a connection to a degree, because after all, if you're a student at UF, eventually, one way or the other, after a while, you got to get a degree, right? One of the wonderful things, in fact, our first panel is going to feature three of the early interviewers for the African American History program. And these individuals all went on to earn their PhDs at the University of Florida. Two of them are assistant professors now at very august institutions. One of them is University of California presidential postdoc. The fourth is actually a history PhD candidate. And the argument that we made, that the three of us, Marna, Joel, and I made in the beginning, was we could create a history project that would train undergraduate and graduate students, allow them to matriculate, to earn their degrees. They would have wonderful advisors, people like Dr. Sharon Austin, Dr. Zohar Simmons, many others, that we could connect to the community, and that we could really tell the history of the University of Florida in a new kind of way. And I want to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank, again, I cannot thank him enough, the gentleman who really listened to us. He listened to us make our pitch. If any of you know Provost Glover, you know that he's a person who listens to a good argument, makes up his mind based on the evidence, and will provide resources if he feels like you have something good going on. And Joe Glover, from the very beginning, Provost Glover, has supported this project, again, both with resources, but also moral support and encouragement. And so I want to take the opportunity once again to thank Provost Glover. So before I close, I want to say a few things about the rest of the weekend. And again, if you'll take a look at your programs for a minute. Our first panel coming up, and we're going to have a break for you, and again, we have pastries, and we still have refreshments outside. Our first panel is going to be the panel featuring, again, Randy Gill-Sattler, Justin Hosby, Justin Dunovit, early interviewers with the African American History Project, and also Raja Rahim, who's a history PhD student. That will start at 10 a.m. Again, if you just arrived, we have restrooms right out in the lobby. We have a shuttle going back and forth on a regular basis between here and the North Lawn, where many of you parked. We'll also have a courtesy shuttle at lunch at 12:45. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not thank our wonderful staff at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. You've already met them. Many of them you've signed in. They had the idea, by the way, for the bags. How many of you like the bags? They're really, that was not my idea. But the graphic design I thought was really, really extraordinary. And so again, if you have any questions during the course of the next few days, please make sure to ask the staff. And just to give you a brief overview, if you look at the program again today, this afternoon, we'll be talking about gator tails. President Fox mentioned it. We have a special edited version, which runs about 50 minutes. We're really honored to have in our presence Mr. Albert White, who is featured by a performer in that play, which we filmed. How many of you have seen Gator Tales already? So quite a few, but a lot of people haven't, and you're in for a real treat. This is a special edited version. It features the narratives of Evelyn Marie Moore Mickle, Albert White, and Bernard Hicks. And afterwards, Mrs. Mickle and Mr. White and Mr. Hicks are going to give us some reflections on what it feels like to experience someone performing your story on stage. One of the exciting trends in oral history is, I mean, it's great for us to give lectures, to give talks, to write books, but performance has become a major force within the oral history world. It's really fun to see narrators' experiences performed on stage. And it gives us an added value of being able to work between the humanities, between the social sciences, between the arts, and it really makes an impact. We have screen gator tales all across the state in different parts of the country, and I've seen people's eyes light up. I've seen people, kind of click. They'll read about the civil rights movement. They'll read about segregation. They'll read about the memory of slavery. And it's one thing to read it in a book. That's wonderful. We love to read books. But when they see these performances on stage, it really clicks with them. The last thing I wanted to do is also to welcome our guests and visitors from out of state, our scholars, our panelists. If you have come from out of state, please raise your hand so we can recognize you. Actually, stand. Look at you. Okay. And I've been advised that maybe the video will work. Oh, here we go.
States, racial segregation rested on the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, an infamous Supreme Court case in 1896 which established the legality of a so-called separate but equal relationship between the white descendants of European colonists and the black descendants of the Africans that they had enslaved for over a century. This period of constitutionally legalized segregation would end with the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1965. However, unofficially, racial segregation in the United States has undeniably continued in neighborhoods, public schools, churches, restaurants, and elsewhere up until the present day. Authors such as the social scientist Beverly Tatum Hill, who wrote "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" and activists such as Margaret Block of SNCC, who quoted Martin Luther King's statement that integration was like running into a burning building, have addressed the complexity of U.S. integration history, and there is a need for historians to step up and do the same. This podcast will explore the integration experience of Joelle Buchanan, a black man from Alachua County who, as a young boy, was one of the first children to integrate a white school in Gainesville.
I lived closer to Gainesville High School, that was a white school, than I did to Lincoln High School, that was a Negro school. I was very involved in the integration of the NAACP, the activities in Gainesville, and they needed some students to test to see if the school system would allow students to go to neighborhood schools. So several parents, my parents was one, that followed suit against the school board. And they said, okay, we would let it go. We're going to do it quietly, selected the first time. We want the very better students. So I don't know how they selected 50 students to take a series of tests. I took a portion of the college entrance examination in 9th grade. The room was so cold that day, I remember having to put my fingers between my legs to warm it up. But what was interesting, when I took the test, there was a white boy taking the test too. So I guess he was a plant. I don't know. So out of the 50, the top 3 was chosen, and they said from the beginning, we have 1 boy and 2 girls. And I'm not the most masculine. He-man. And I was tiny at that time, so I guess I was able to use the power of the pencil. And plus, they had to have parents, children of parents who was willing to support them financially, mentally, wholesomely, that they were able to curtail their life to work with them. Our phone number was changed. It was told to my mother, Joelle just cannot bounce around anywhere because a student could be mad and upset Joelle. So they had to be willing to work with me. And they were very supportive. I realized that there was a lot of activity going because prior to that date, I had met with the former Dean of Women, of the Dean of Students at Lincoln High School, the Chief of Police, to discuss the activity that would take place the day of school, and that we would have police protection from the time I left my home until I returned from school. And there was a lot of interest going on. My house was buzzing. The article had appeared in the paper that the school would be integrated. They did not discuss who the 3 of the students were. I remember being awakened by my mother, having breakfast, and being told that we are praying for you today, but you will not become ill or give in. It's going to be a difficult day, but you will survive. And now remember, the school had several thousands of students, and I was going to be the only black boy there, and the other 2 were girls. And this did not happen in this city or this state ever in the history prior to this day.
One aspect of white privilege in America is the ability to work and live in a city without feeling like an outsider or other. For many people of color who work, attend school, and live in predominantly white communities around the U.S., every day can be an integration experience. As proved by the recent murders of Trayvon Martin and Renisha McBride, being a person of color in a white-dominated space can still be a very dangerous experience. Joel shares the memory of entering class in the cafeteria on his first day at Gainesville High as the only black boy in his state to attend a white high school.
I was not aware of it until later that the FBI had arranged for us to have a driver. And the person that took us to school was the president of the local NAACP here in Gainesville, Thomas Alexander Wright, Reverend Wright. He came to my door, picked me up in his car, and he had a white Cadillac, and we had, not aware of it until later, there was a planned route for us to school and from school. We arrived at school, and it was planned prior time that we would not be on campus until after school was in session. So school started at 8:15. We arrived on campus at 8:45. We were greeted in the front of the school by the principal, the assistant principal, and I recalled directly across from the school several police cars that was across from the school, and they were there the entire duration of that day. It was discussed being killed, that there was a possibility we could be assassinated, killed. At that point, death did not mean to me what death it means today, because if I had known or even thought that there was a remote chance that Joel could have been shot, and there were several students who were killed integrating schools or who were being integrated in schools, I would not have gone through the effort. But at that point, I was not aware of it. We went into the office to collect ourselves and for them to get together. And I was escorted to my class, my homeroom class. And my homeroom teacher was Mrs. Grant. And when I walked into class, into the room, class was in session, but there was a seat left vacant for Joel Buchanan. And I walked in. You would never know because you're not black and you would never understand this. The hush. The room was busy with noise. There were chatter going on the first day of school. They did not know that I would be coming into class. She was aware of it. When I appeared at the door, instantly the room became quiet. And Mrs. Grant looked at me like I'm looking at you. She had not met me previously. I walked in. She said, "Class, this is Joel Buchanan. Say good morning to him." We walked in like it is in a cafeteria. You had several hundreds of students eating. Busy, noisy. And these three little chocolate guys and girls walked in, and the room became quiet. And the cafeteria was like half of an H, but an H horizontally. During that period, we were trying to integrate restaurants and hotels, and you could walk into a restaurant that is just busy with people having fun, and you walk in, it just became quiet. I mean, silence. Then there were teachers. Now, we had problems with students, of course, but we had problems with teachers too. Some of these people had taught school for 30 years. I was the first Negro that they had taught. I could not be equal to them. I was not equal. So there was a problem there also. So because Mrs. X was my teacher does not mean that she was liberal and understanding. I had to get beyond that. And then with the pressures I had on just being there, trying to do the work, knowing that my work was being reviewed on an x-ray, that became difficult. One girl who was the fourth one, it publicly was printed that she was in 10th grade at a black school, but at Gainesville High School she would have the equivalence of a fourth grader. That was front page information. So one morning I would have breakfast and my mother said to me, "Young man, here's a copy of your test." The results of my test was newspaper information.
Joel is proud of his participation in public school desegregation. He and the other two African American students who entered Gainesville High School with him that day all went on to graduate with honors. Joel believes that the trials of his teenage years at Gainesville High School gave him a greater sense of self. As an adult, he is still making history and desegregating in Gainesville. Now, by collecting oral histories from the local African American community to expand records of African American history and diversify the Samuel Proctor Oral History Collection at the University of Florida.
Of how oral history is used both to teach, and I think that was Chelsea Carnes doing the interview. She earned her bachelor's degree here. She went on to earn her MA in community studies. I was actually had the honor of being on her MA thesis committee. This interview, this chance to do the podcast really transformed Chelsea's life, and you can hear the wonderful interplay between Joel and the interviewer. You're white, you wouldn't understand, but I'm going to try to tell you. This is the kind of incredible communication that's taking place in these oral histories. Oral history pushes us beyond our comfort zones, right? We talk a lot in education about, comfort zones, and we want to create safe spaces. Oral history is not that. Oral history pushes you outside of your immediate environment. It brings you in contact with incredible experiences that you didn't have growing up. The person interviewing Joel Buchanan didn't have to ever walk into a class and everyone is becomes silent. The person doing the interview never had to hear that even though she was in 10th grade, she really was at a 4th grade level. Imagine the trauma and the pain. And one of the really amazing things about the oral history collection, which Joel Buchanan really started here, was he wanted us to emphasize the subjectivity of African American experiences. Because that first generation of civil rights history scholarship emphasized the idea that that first generation of black students who integrated schools in the South and other parts of the country were very heroic. It was an uplifting, powerful, positive story. And on one hand, that is true. It was heroic. But Joel Buchanan wanted us to remember the pain, the anguish, the suffering of what it meant to be the first. Being told by your parents, you have to do this, we have to do this, but we're going to have to suffer for the entire nation, really for the sins of the nation in many ways, to try to make things better. But that anguish and that pain is still there. And what we've learned in the oral history world, not just here, but all throughout the country, is if we deny that pain, if we try to hide the stories of suffering, if we try to, if we forget the kind of stories that Joel was telling this young student from the University of Florida, if we forget those stories, we can never really come together today, honestly, right? Because if we try to cover up the past, try to cover up our histories, then we'll never really live honest lives together, will we? And so these are some of the wonderful things that Joel Buchanan really emphasized to us. Before I close out today, and we have about a 10-minute break, I want to turn your attention to these two posters in the front. The first one here was titled Florida Black History, Where We Stand in the Age of Barack Obama. This was the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's first African American history public program. Guess who the facilitator was? Exactly. And we had the event back in 2009. I will never forget President Bernie Matchin was sitting in the front row, and President Matchin, by the way, will be with us tomorrow to help give a remembrance of Joel Buchanan. And I remember Dr. Zohar Simmons. I remember Dan Harmeling. I remember Mrs. Mickle. It was really an amazing panel. I remember Marna Weston. And that was the public program that really kicked off the African American History Project. And that was the impetus for us to do these amazing oral history interviews. And so the other poster I want to commend your attention to is another kind of project that we've been able to do with the African American History Project, which is to do oral history workshops throughout the state. This particular workshop was done with the members of Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church in Melbourne, Florida. And you'll see the signatures they signed and gave us this wonderful kind of memento. And we've been able to do oral history workshops with communities, churches, unions, and high school classes all across the state of Florida, again, thanks to the support of the Office of the Provost. And so as we close out this morning, again, I want us to have a good time. Pace yourself. It's going to be a very exciting day, a very, very exciting next 2 days. Again, please ask the staff of the Oral History Program if you have any questions whatsoever, and we'll reconvene here about 10 o'clock for our first panel. Thank you for being here again. We're going to go ahead and start our first official panel, conducting oral histories, challenges, impacts, and legacies. And while people are coming in, we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. It's just a real treat and an honor to be able to just facilitate this first panel. There's something all the panelists have in common. They all have me on their dissertation committees at some point or the other, but they turn out okay, right? Yeah. And it's,
All but one.
yeah. It's really amazing because each of these scholars conducted a lot of the oral history interviews that make an integral part of the Joel Buchanan archive of oral history. They're going to talk this morning about the impact of doing those interviews when they were in the field doing oral history work. Some of them worked together. Some of them, you'll hear from Raja Rahim, who did a really amazing project in St. Augustine. And by the way, we have is Floyd and Gail Phillips, the co-directors of Lincolnville Museum, I think, are here. I saw them at some point, and Gail will be talking a bit later. But each of our former students, I should say Raja Rahim is still a history PhD candidate, so she's still a student. But we're all students of life for the rest of our lives, right? That's the case. So we're all students, right? So what I'll do is just commend your attention to the program. We're going to omit long introductions, but I do want to mention that Randy Gill-Sattler joins us from Lafayette College, Justin Hosby from Emory University, Justin Donovan, UC Santa Cruz and Vanderbilt, Raja Rahim, University of Florida. And what we're going to do this morning is I gave the panelists some questions in advance, but they have been scheming together. And they think they schemed together at the hotel and decided to take over the program. And so what I'm going to do is just simply hand the mic over. What I asked them to kind of think about, though, was what kind of impact has the interviews made on you? Doing the interviews, thinking about them, your scholarly trajectory, what was it like doing them? And they're going to go one at a time, and I'll turn the mic over to Justin Hosby.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. Okay. It's wonderful to be back at the University of Florida, and thank you again for the invitation, Dr. Ortiz. And I think the African American History program has been a really transformative space for me in terms of my own research project, my own intellectual agenda as well. Being at AHP allowed me to engage with oral history in a way that as an anthropologist, I wasn't necessarily trained in how to do. I have been trained to do ethnographic field work. And my research has taken me to New Orleans, Louisiana, but while I was at the University of Florida, I was able to join AAHP and actually do some oral history interviews here locally throughout North and Central Florida, where I got to really learn so much about the long civil rights movement. And I think as an anthropologist, I wasn't trained as a historian, so I always had an interest in civil rights history and African American history, but it was also, a hobby. I just love black history. But being able to engage with Dr. Ortiz and his work, and also to be able to go to interview some amazing Floridians who've been involved in the civil rights movement for most of the 20th century was really impactful for me. I think that it's important to think about the way that African American oral history can sometimes fill in some critical gaps in what we kind of know on the historiographical record, and some really key ways that oral history interviews really show you the depth, as we saw in the first clip from earlier this morning, the depth through which people are really speaking from their life experiences in ways that I think, oftentimes when you read the text, you can't really get a sense of the feeling and the emotion behind it. And I think the oral history allows you to tap into some of what those feelings are. So I think that on me personally, the interviews impacted me because I think it's a very intense experience to do an oral history. I think that when you sit with someone and you kind of have a direct link with one individual and you're asking them to give you some really important details about my life history, if you ask someone, the first question that we typically asked, as a standard practice was, trying to tell me about the oldest relative that you can remember. People would often say, well, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and these stories stretch back to the 19th century. So you have this kind of the weight of history. People express that to you in such a direct one-on-one way with oral history. You can't really engage in that process without being transformed by it. I think that in terms of thinking through, how do you translate interviews? How do you think through how people make sense of their lives? How do you think through, social movements in general as well. I think that when doing these interviews, we learned a lot about how Black Floridians engage with, a host of means and ways to get their civil rights in this country. And I think that the beauty of oral history in this project was that we were able to explore in some critical depth in the archive and fill in some critical gaps that were there. So it just, as personally, it impacted me intensely as an anthropologist, because in doing ethnographic field work, it's not the same as oral history interviewing, but I brought those techniques and tools that I learned with Dr. Ortiz to my ethnographic field of research. So it was wonderful the way that the work in Florida actually helped contour, complement, and strengthen my own research project in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. That was nice. So I came to the oral history program. I'm Randy Gill Sadler, and I came to the oral history program actually through Justin Donovan. He kind of recruited me and asked me to come along. I trained as a literary scholar, particularly 20th century African American and Afro-Caribbean women's literature. So this was really my first foray into doing any kind of interviewing as a research method. And so it's very different because with books, you check out the text, I know what's going to be there, I can write in it, it's reliable. Not always the same with the oral history interview when you're dealing with actual people and interviewees in that process. So for me, impacted me professionally through skill set and research methods. I was able to grow through doing oral history interviews, but also rethink how I was thinking about archives. Our archives as literary scholars are, novels, short stories, fiction, poetry, but thinking through how do I analyze an interview helped me grow as far as my textual analysis, my critical thinking, but also how do I let these materials speak for themselves as opposed to speaking for them or through them with my own interpretation. I think personally I would echo what Justin said as far as the personal impact is that it's a very intimate research process, right? Sitting down with someone and talking to them about their lives, sometimes for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. We were talking last night, some of these people we probably know a little bit more in depth than their family, their closest friends, just based on the information that they gave us. And I think that really kind of raised the stakes for me as far as what the research means and how you handle it, to be handling people's lives, their personal and intimate details, and then how do you kind of put that information back into the community in a meaningful way and not just a way that sometimes with research is what happens is you kind of take this information, you publish it, and it furthers your career, right? But how do you do this research in a way that actually builds community and do it in an ethical way? So I think personally and professionally it raised important critical and ethical questions about how we carry, communicate, and translate Black life.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raja Rahim. How did I come into oral history? Actually, I started with the Sam Proctor Oral History Program in 2016. However, upon applying to the University of Florida, I made it very clear that it was in my best interest to come and work with Dr. Paul Ortiz and the Sam Proctor Oral History Program. I had gained an interest in oral history through my master's work at North Carolina Central University, where we started doing oral histories to document the civil rights movement in Durham, North Carolina. From segregation into actually Black Lives Matter is where our time frame actually extended, if I can use our nice title for this great symposium that we're having here. But through that, but through that research, through that research, I was able to, as Justin and Randy have already said, gain that personal interaction with individuals who had a long impact, to meet people who knew A. Philip Randolph and who she could stand on her own 2 feet at the age of 99 to say, no, I started the chapter here in Durham, North Carolina. Feisty, vibrant Black woman. that's a spark for me in a reflection and someone that I could identify with. So coming here to the University of Florida, I was definitely interested in continuing that research, expanding my knowledge into Florida and understanding Florida history. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia, then I spent years in North Carolina, so I was not familiar with what we now come to call the Deep South. Technically, when I go back home, welcome back to the Upper South. So coming here, I was able to gain a greater knowledge in Florida history. And through my work in St. Augustine, working with my great colleague, Anne-Marie Nichols, who is here in the back, and also partnering with the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center and being able to work with the directors, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, I was able to gain a greater knowledge, not just in the civil rights history of Florida. And I want to be clear because a lot of times when we talk about African American history, a lot of that history gets wrapped up on civil rights and this idea of a long civil rights. But working in St. Augustine and looking at the history and the lives of African Americans there, especially in the community of Lincolnville, you see the importance of the black church, black education, the ways that black businesses organized to help out civil rights activists who came into their towns. And I think that a lot of times those histories are ignored, and through doing oral histories, we bring those stories to light, that if it wasn't for these individuals who were on the ground, working in these black communities, organizing through their churches, through their businesses, that the civil rights movement and the places where it happened wouldn't have those roots and that foundation to really make the impact that we have come to know today. And I think that is very important. And one thing about oral history, and I think when I look at oral history and its impact, is the way it challenged us to look at the politics of academia, meaning that I don't necessarily aspire to be a teacher, one necessarily just teaching my students the facts and the events that happen through history, but I aspire to be an educator, one who challenges my students to think critically about the world in which they live and to acquire knowledge and to keep questioning the knowledge that they have come to understand. And I think that is one of the important things that oral history teaches us when you sit down face to face and talk to someone one-on-one.
Good morning. Thank you all for being out here. And thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for inviting us back. My name is Justin Dunavant. I completed my PhD in 2017 in archaeology. So again, we're all coming from different areas other than future Dr. Rahim. We are multidisciplinary in our backgrounds and in our trainings. But I think it's interesting that we were all attracted to the oral history program. And I was first attracted to the oral history program sort of out of necessity. I did my undergraduate degree at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Thank you. It's good. From there, I went to the University of West Indies in Jamaica for a year. And then 2 weeks after leaving Jamaica, I come to Gainesville, Florida. And you can imagine being in Washington, D.C., going to Jamaica, and coming to Gainesville. There's a bit of a stark difference in the landscape. So for me, one of the early things I tried to do here was to locate and try to become established in the black community in Gainesville. And I looked around, and ironically, there weren't a whole lot of professors on the university's campus that were doing that. So I attended the first session called An Evening with the Dews. And I believe one of the Dews remembers that event very well. That was the first university program I attended here when I became a graduate student here. And from there, I followed up to figure out what was the organization that put on this event and who were the people involved. And from there, I met Mr. Marner Weston in the back, one of the leading pioneers in African American Oral History Project. And then, of course, Dr. Ortiz. And I found out, I said, regardless of what I do in archaeology, I need to make sure that I have some association with this research center and this program. I didn't know that that would turn into a sort of 5, 6, possibly 7-year relationship with the program.
Keep going.
Right. And to be honest, I don't think my advisors and my faculty in archaeology actually knew what I did at the oral history program. They just knew I had an office at Hugh Hall. But oral history was really a way for me to truly understand what it means to be an academic and a public academic, in the sense of we have commitments that extend beyond this university. And it extends not just in the ways that we translate our research to the community, but in terms of understanding what are the needs of the community, what's the history of the community, what's the community's relationship to the institution, and in what ways can the university be of benefit to the community. And I think many of us forget that that's the primary purpose of a university institution, is to be of benefit to the community. And so that being in the oral history program helped me recenter that. And I think one of the reasons why it's often difficult is because it is a slow process. We do spend many hours, many days sitting with people, listening to stories, helping out at community events, going to birthdays, going to funerals, going to church meetings, going to family reunions for people that we don't really know that well, or people that we will come to know and adopt us as family. And so in many ways, it helps us to recenter our sense of purpose, being in the oral history program. The other aspect of it is understanding it as a sort of additional tool that we use as researchers and as public intellectuals. As an archaeologist, my goal is to dig in the ground, to get the material culture in terms of to tell that story about what the experience was like for, at times in my research specifically, enslaved Africans and later free Africans. But here, oral history is a unique tool that we can gather more information about that history of their descendants and of our descendants, and to figure out how, we've been able to navigate certain situations, and not just navigate, but also proliferate in instances and in circumstances where we weren't necessarily supposed to develop and grow. So in that way, the oral history program has been good in helping me recenter my questions in the way I think about the world, and the way I think about the ways that we've persisted in the many areas that we have. I would also like to say that oral history is it's unique in the sense that it's put me into conversations with, centenarians, people that are 100 years old. It's put me in intergenerational conversations that I wouldn't have otherwise been in. And I'm starting to realize as I leave the oral history program how rare it is for us to be in intergenerational conversations generally, and more specifically, intergenerational conversations with people who aren't our direct family. And I think that that's something that's greatly needed at this time, and something that will continue to be needed. And oral history has allowed us to do that. I also find out it's not just a one-way sort of conversation, but a two-way street as well. There are many out there who really want their stories to be told and really want people to listen to it, but then also want feedback and perspectives. What did you think about the Obama election? Talking to somebody who's 80 years old versus talking to somebody who's in their 20s, we get two very different approaches. But those perspectives are ways for us to have a dialogue about a larger conversation. And so it's not just the act of recording this history to put it in an archive, but it's actually the process itself of conducting the interview as a way to sort of, in some cases, heal, in some cases, develop some new understandings between each other. And then in many cases, just to show the community that there is a relationship here between these institutions, and that we have as much of a commitment to you as you all have to us, particularly as a student. And I guess I'd just like to conclude in this initial introduction in saying that, going to Ruby's, meeting individuals in the community, establishing ourselves in these community relationships and these events is something that I think has a lasting impact way beyond anything we could have initially conceived of. Public meetings, people see you and they interact with you on the street outside of that. And it feels good to be able to walk down the street in downtown Gainesville years after I graduated and still be able to say hello to people and still see people greet me. See some of the custodial staff here still remember my name. That feels good. It feels good. And I think I couldn't have done that without the oral history program and the work that we've done there. So thank you.
Starting with our next panel, we're going to begin to hear from wonderful individuals who are some of our narrators, people who we've interviewed over the course of the years. And we want to get their perspectives too, but I thought I would ask maybe one more round of questions of our distinguished panel. If you could think back on an impactful interview that really meant something to you that you still think about, maybe you might use it in the classroom, just an interview that really kind of just really you remember.
I think for me, one of the most impactful interviews I think that I did while at AAHP was with a man named Mr. Anthony Ray Hinton, and that was actually in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Equal Justice Institute there. And the EJI, Brian Stevenson is the founder of that, but the EJI is kind of dedicated to thinking about people who have been, kind of celebrating the history, well, not celebrating, but kind of exploring the history of lynching in America, and also thinking about the ways in which the contemporary criminal justice system perpetuates some of those kind of anti-black racist ways of distributing criminal justice. So Mr. Anthony Ray Hinton actually was someone who was on death row for about 30 years approximately for a crime that he did not commit in Alabama. So I was able to interview him, I think maybe it would have been 3 weeks after he was actually exonerated and released from death row. And I think that in interviewing that having an interview with him with a team of also other undergraduate students at SPOP, I learned a lot about really the failures of the criminal justice system in a way that was really, really visceral, because speaking to someone who had been incarcerated from the age of 19 years old until the age of, 30 years later, 48 years old, and hearing him speak about the way that so much of his life was lost in the ways that were irreparable. But what I took from that interview was that throughout all that he'd been through, he talked about how, in many ways it impacted his social life in the sense that because I've been in solitary confinement for 30 years, I'm uncomfortable in spaces where there are lots of people. So going to malls makes me uncomfortable. He says that, now in his bed at home, he has a queen-size bed, but he said that from sleeping in a cot for so many years, he sleeps in his own bed in that same kind of fetal position that he slept in for most of his adult life. And thinking about the kind of trauma that has on an individual, and then him breaking down really his case and showing how when he was actually kind of put up for trial, there were several moments in which the prosecutor saw exculpatory evidence and chose not to include it, in ways in which he could have been exonerated because the tie that connected him to that particular crime was that his mother owned a particular gun, and the same type of gun that his mother owned was used in that particular crime. So he actually was working when the incident happened. I think there was a robbery at a Pizza Hut, and he was actually at work somewhere else, and he said that at his job where he worked in the factory, the doors were locked. He could not leave. So the way that he was placed in that position to have robbed those Pizza Huts, it was all false. It was all untrue. And it was really tied to the political campaign of that prosecutor who wanted to become Attorney General of the state of Alabama. So this man's life kind of became fodder for this own person's, political ambitions in Alabama. So in hearing his history and learning about Anthony Ray Hinton, and I teach this because it's so powerful, because to me it shows you really, and I think oral history also shows you that how despite whatever happens in terms of structural violence, in terms of imprisonment, the human spirit is always going to still hold on as best it can. And I asked Anthony Hinton, are you angry? Are you bitter? And he said, no, I'm not. He said, because now my life's calling is to then tell the world about my experiences and stop the death penalty from happening anymore. And I think that, I teach that to my students. Actually, that interview is on SoundCloud as well, so you can Google that. But I like to teach that to my students because oftentimes I think that in a really abstract way, they know the criminal justice system is really, really, they know there are racist elements of it, but I think that it's kind of still abstract. And I think that hearing a narrative of someone who was on death row, who got off of death row, who was exonerated, and who can still have the passion and the vigor for life to kind of explore and tell you about my trauma. And I think that that's a responsibility that we actually have in doing oral history interviews, because oftentimes people share with you traumatic experiences. And I think about, what are the ethical implications of how do you then, in that process, support that person as just a human being? Because if you're sharing these details with me as a human being, I want to support you, but then I don't want to be exploitative after the process as well. So what are some ways in which, to kind of think about the ethics of doing this kind of work and think about where this work travels as well? Those are important things. But I think Anthony Ray Hinton, you can Google him and find about his story. He's a public speaker now in many ways, but he's a phenomenal human being. And I think that his life story kind of shows you some really critical gaps in the American criminal justice system. And I think that his advocacy now for ending the death penalty, I think it's really powerful and amazing. So that was the most impactful interview I think that I did while at AHP.
So I have two, if that's okay. So every now and again when we would do oral histories in the AHP, you know, you kind of have like a setup interview, right? You interview this person to kind of get their life, but also hoping that that interview leads to some other leads. So you can kind of get to know a community and find some other interlocutors. And so I remember one of my very first interviews, we had someone who came from, I think it was White Springs, Florida, who came down to kind of give an interview. And it's actually an older white man who came to give this interview, and we were trying to get some more details about the actual area that we were going to be doing oral history in. And during that interview, he spoke about growing up and going to school, our kind of traditional questions that we asked. And he mentioned that he had a black female domestic worker who helped him and his family out. And so being interested in that, I started to probe and say, oh, you know, what was her name? Do you know anything about her? And it was a kind of telling moment because he didn't really recall anything about this woman, but reiterated that she was there every day, taking him to school, but he couldn't recall her name. He didn't know anything about her family. And so that was kind of my first interview. And in that moment, there's something very kind of ambiguous about oral history, because on the one hand, you're getting all this information, and at the same time, you have these moments where black people are so elusive, even though they're very present in people's lives, right? And so that to me was a kind of startling moment that didn't just index facts, but also how some things exceed facts, right? What can we actually know from an interview? And oftentimes we would have interviews with people who would sit and talk to us for 2 hours, but never had been asked about black people and black women in particular and their roles in their lives, who would call back the next day and say, hey, I asked my mom about this, or I went and asked her about, you know, this particular person, or this jogged my memory. So it was that kind of tension with oral history where you see how truly slippery memory is, and how, you know, some of the potential but also limits in that experience when you are calling on people to recall things. So that was one moment. But I guess my most memorable moment for me is that I got the opportunity to interview Nikki Giovanni like 3 years ago. 3 years ago? Yeah. Yeah, so she came here as the Black History Month speaker, and our other colleague who's not here, AJ Donaldson, helped put that together and, you know, asked me if I wanted to interview her, and I was like, absolutely, you know, she's one of my heroes. And I think that was a memorable moment because someone of her stature and what she did for not just the black arts movement, but black poetry in the 20th century, to have the opportunity to, you know, sit down with her. First, I just had to figure out, like, am I even going to be able to speak, or am I just going to be fangirling over her the whole time? But to meet someone like that who has done so much for African-American literature, African-American politics, African-American thought, and to have her be so generous, so down to earth, and so open, it really kind of exceeded this kind of research moment, because she really is someone who is a hero to me in so many ways. But to have that opportunity, I never would have had that without the oral history program, but also to the kind of work and community that I've built with my peers, right? People who are not in my field, but who understand the significance of my expertise as a literary scholar to interview this particular person. So that was probably the biggest moment for me, to have that filmed and documented. And she actually said it's one of the best interviews she ever did, okay? But just to have those, we've had moments where we've had people who we really admire and giants across all of our fields. We've had the opportunity to interact with them that have been just super meaningful and significant. So yeah.
Ooh, okay, I have two as well, I think. Yeah, from the same project, the St. Augustine African American History Project that I started working on in the summer of 2016. The first interview was with a black woman who, at the age of 16, joined the Civil Rights Movement. Me and my colleague, Anne Marie, sat in on this interview together, and she recalls that experience. And this is one of the first times that she actually opens up and talks about this experience. And her son, who is of age, probably in his 50s, was sitting in to listen to her story. But she recalls at the age of 16 walking out of high school, joining college students at Florida Memorial when it was in St. Augustine at the time, and walking to what has become known as the Slave Plaza. She goes on to tell numerous stories. She talks about the first time meeting Dr. King, and she states that his hands were soft like cotton, right? But that's not the most important or most impactful part of her story. She goes on to tell us about one night when they went on a march, how they met and organized at a church, headed out to the march, which was around the Slave Plaza. She talks about the violence that they faced once reaching the plaza, having bricks thrown at them, dogs, rocks, anything you can think of at the time. And she recalls coming back to the church, and she remembers this one lady who she points out was about my size. If I stand up, I'm about 5'1" and a quarter. Don't forget the quarter. And she states that they have beaten her so bad that her eyes look like eggs. How do you sit with that? How do you respond to that? And in the process of this interview, she starts crying. What do we do now? I look, me and Anne-Marie have this look. And she doesn't necessarily want us to stop, but we sit in that moment with her. Because this is the first time she's really opening up about this story that happened, right? That's one. The second one was with a man named James Jackson, who I heard about 2 years before I even sat down to interview with him. I heard about him and I saw him before I had the pleasure of sitting down with him. In the summer of 2016, I'm riding through St. Augustine on US 1, one of the main intersections and roads in that area. And I see this guy, this black man in his late 80s, standing with a sign that says Black Lives Matter. He's the only one out there. He has a black shirt on, black pants, and anybody has ever been in St. Augustine in the summer, oh, it's hot. But he was there from when I arrived and when I left. And I was like, that's him. That's the guy that I'm supposed to interview, right? Fast forward 2 years later, we sit down and interview with this guy, with Mr. Jackson. His story is that he survived a lynching in St. Augustine in September of 1963. He was one of 3 others who were captured by the Ku Klux Klan when they, as African American activists in St. Augustine, thought it was a good idea and a great idea to go spy on the Klan to see what they were proposing for them the next day. They end up getting captured. And he sits down and he tells this story. And at the time, he was 18, 19 of age, the youngest out of those who were captured. And he tells his story about being captured, being beat. And me retelling the story does not do it any justice, so I would tell you all to listen to the interview. It has already been made into a video and ready to go. Right, Miss Deborah? But he recalls this moment of being hit repeatedly, refusing not to fall. He recalls them saying what to do with them, to set him on fire, to lynch him. And the moment they said castrate, he said, I gotta go. I gotta figure it out. But in that moment of him telling that story, it's great to see that in that moment, as you all took a laugh, years later, he was able to sit back and laugh at that one moment. But throughout that interview, you can tell when he paused, when he recalled a loud cry that he heard coming from another one of his friends. You can see in those moments the impact that that had. But the best part of his story is the resilience. How the very next day, with bandages wrapped around his head, he got into a convertible and drove around the slave plaza where the KKK was having their rally, saying, "You may have knocked me down, but you have not won. We're still here." And even to this day, his interview is impactful because in that interview, he wants to sit down with former members of, and former descendants at this point of those who were in the Klan, who enacted that beating on him. And he said there's no animosities, no hard feelings, but it's time to come together to talk about it, to have those conversations. That's the impact of all interviews. Dr. Helen.
Since everybody's taking two, I guess I'll take two as well.
Sorry.
I do want to say, I think it's important to note that I've sat in on many of these interviews that they're talking about, and I think it's important to note that these are just as impactful for everybody in the room as it is for the individual interviewee. And one of the things I can say in the beauty of working with my colleagues in oral history is that you learn something new with each iteration of an interview. You know, I learned from Justin when he was interviewing Anthony Ray Hinton to take time and literally thank the interviewee for sharing their story. Yes. And we all felt that, but we didn't find words to express it in the way that he did. I remember Randy when she was interviewing Nikki Giovanni, and she said, "I want to do a word association." And what was the first word you hit her with? Was it her grandmother's name?
Yes.
She hit it with her grandmother's name as the first word. University of Florida, far away from home. The first word she gets is her grandmother's name. Causes a point of reflection. It's a different way of approaching the interview. And then, of course, Raja being able to bring out those stories, those deep, impactful stories in a way that somebody can actually talk about it today in a way that sort of translates it is important. So I think it's important to recognize that in the way that these interviews sort of progress. Two that I think of off the top of my head. One is an interview I actually did with Dr. Sherry Dupree in Ocala with Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds. His interview was so impactful in part because of the dynamism of him as an individual and of his family. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we often don't think about is how dynamic we are as people and individuals. Oftentimes when we approach an interview, the first thing people will say is, "I have no story. Why do you want to listen to me?" Mr. Reynolds was somebody who moved his family from Washington, D.C. to Rosewood, Florida, after he'd already lived in Ocala. But he didn't just move his family from Washington, D.C. to Rosewood, Florida. This man got on a boat and sailed from Washington, D.C. down to Rosewood, Florida, his entire family. But one of the important stories he told was in the 1940s during segregation. He was going from, I believe it was Orlando to Ocala by bus. And bus after bus was filled up. And they were trying to get seats. There were no seats left in the back of the bus. There was one seat left in the front. By the third time this happened, one seat left in the front of the bus right behind the driver. So this man, of course, knew that the front of the bus was reserved for whites only. So he faked a Cuban accent, told the manager that he was Cuban, and he was just trying to get back home so he could leave the country. And these people didn't know what to do. So the manager talked to his boss. His boss came back. There was deliberation. They eventually let him sit at the front of the bus, right behind his bus driver, in segregated Florida. And all along the way, people kept saying, "What is this doing at the front of the bus?" And he stayed quiet, continued his fake accent until he got to his home in Ocala. And his cousin, as soon as he stepped off the bus, said, "Leonard, what are you doing at the front of the bus?" And it's stories like that that show me the ways in which we not only navigate this world, but we make humor out of it, the ways in which we circumvent it, and we show every day that, we're here to stay. And this is our story, and this is our presence. The other impactful interview was with Dr. Simmons. And it was impactful in a different way. Again, the dynamism of individuals. We often don't know how dynamic the people are around us, the stories they have and the things they have done. And literally the things that Dr. Simmons has done have appeared in books that I have read later with people I knew nothing about. And I think to be able to sit next to somebody, to walk past the hallway of somebody who has had those experiences, made those contributions, and gone through all of that, there was never a question in my mind I doubted getting my PhD. Because I couldn't let her down. Because I knew she was at the end of the hall, and she did this, and she did so much more than this. And so that was a daily motivation after hearing just a piece of your story. I think we sat maybe for an hour and a half, and we maybe only covered the highlights of a 10-year time frame. So I thank you for that experience, and I encourage you all to listen to those interviews as well as they're on the Oral History website, and they're available and open to the public.
Well, now we have the opportunity to ask our panelists questions. I'll circulate with the mic, and if you could speak into the mic, because we're recording. And if you can briefly identify yourself.
Sheila Payne, and I may have missed this, but Justin, my favorite part of Mr. Hinton's story is could you talk about how he said he wasn't going to spend 1 minute being bitter for the rest of his life, and how he just wanted to live after he got out? It's very moving.
Thank you, Ms. Sheila. Yeah, I think for him, it was funny because as I was talking to him, I could see from the beginning of the interview his very vibrant, lovable personality. And it was so jarring to think of someone after talking to him for at least for the first 20 minutes. How could anyone talk to this man and think he'd done this heinous crime? And he talked about how, when he was being prosecuted, he was actually framed in the media as the most dangerous man in Birmingham. And that title, the most dangerous man in Birmingham, was circulating across the city. But I could tell from his spirit, he always spoke in a way, oftentimes in many of our interviews, there's kind of a tragic humor to it, where a joke gets made. And I think it's not necessarily even a coping mechanism. And sometimes it's just because that was kind of funny to think. I, of all people, me who never done, he was like, when I was little, I didn't like playing sports. And I'm the most dangerous man in Birmingham? He's like, that made no sense to me. So, but I think part of it was just who Anthony Hinton was as a person and human being. And I think that was really why, despite what had happened to him, he refused to let go of who he actually was. And that's what I got the sense of, is that with, him saying, my life's calling has changed and shifted and I'm not angry or bitter. On the one hand, he said it was because that would consume him completely if he did succumb to the bitterness. But on the other hand, it was like he just felt like that's not who I am. That's never who I was. So why would I want to succumb to, that anger and that bitterness and not think about the ways in which my life can be transformative now? And he says that, right now he does lots of public talk, but also he did lots of work with black youth in Alabama, and kind of curb them away from the criminal justice system and mentorship. And he just said that my life is so fulfilling now. So I think that despite what happened to him, at the end of the day, he never wanted to lose who he actually was, and never let what the criminal justice system did to him rob him of who he was as a human being and as a person. And I think if that speaks to what you were asking. Yeah.
This is a question to anyone on the panel. Does the person conducting the interview determine the quality of that interview? And let me explain. I have done research on slavery in Florida, and one thing that I found in looking at the slave narratives, and there are probably over 2,300 slave narratives, and a lot of historians say that the Florida slave narratives reveal more than some of the other narratives because of the interviewers, and this was during the Work Progress Administration, WPA, and they had the Negro Writers Division, of which Zora Neale Hurston was a part of. And they interviewed a lot of the former slaves who resided in Florida, and they found that they were more revealing, felt more comfortable, and really talking about their experiences. So again, do you think the person conducting the interview makes a difference in terms of the quality of that interview?
I'll start. Yeah.
No, I think it definitely makes a difference. And I think we've all kind of spoken to it, right? When you are talking to African American elders, I think there's an appropriate way to approach them, an appropriate way to ask them questions. There's a way to ask them questions without actually asking them the question, right? So to me, I think I always carried it, not even that I was necessarily interviewing, you know, an interviewee or an interlocutor, but I'm thinking like, how would I want someone to, you know, approach my great aunt, or how would I want someone to kind of approach my grandfather? And I think in that way, you can establish an intimacy with just kind of general respect for elders and ancestors in a way that I think makes people want to be open. I think I've done group interviews with almost everyone up here, and I think we all have different skill sets also, and different kind of critical knowledge background. So there are certain things that I would say like, okay, you know, Donovan, I think you should start with this. And then these particular questions, I'll come in with this. And maybe Justin Hoseby could kind of end it on this particular note. Knowing that we all have different strengths and we all want different things out of the interview. So that's kind of like the biggest thing, right? The things that I'm looking for in the interview are not necessarily the same, but that's one of the things about oral history that's great, at least the way we did it, was that it was so collaborative and with so many people with so many different skill sets and backgrounds that we really could get really good quality interviews, I think despite whoever was doing it, because we worked together and learned so much from each other.
Hi, Betty Stewart Fullwood. And listening to you talk about doing interviews with quote-unquote complete strangers, how has this impacted your family relationships with grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts? Are you going to that? Because I know a lot of us here wish that we had interviewed and gotten oral written history or audio history of our forefathers. So how has that impacted, if at all?
I just want to say, because, no, me and Justin Donovan actually interviewed my grandmother together. And that was a 2 hour, was that 2 hours, Justin? A 2 hour interview with my grandma. And my grandmother was involved in the Albany movement in Georgia. So her able to go back into her, because she was, I think, 13 or 14 years old when that happened. So hearing my grandmother go back into the recesses of her mind and think about her life, and I think as I learned so much more about her and what she had done through that interview than she'd ever shared with me, I just felt, oh my God, this is why I am the way that I am. Because my grandmother, she kind of, and I thought about the lessons that she taught me kind of implicitly as my grandma. And I'm like, I see why you said certain things to me. You raised me in a certain way because you being involved in that kind of activism as a child yourself. And I think that, you know, my oldest aunt actually went to jail with my grandmother. So thinking about how, yeah, at the time period and this is happening, she was a really young woman living in South Georgia who felt like, no, this has to change. Something has to be done here. And she was she wasn't, you know, she's ordinary grandparents. Her parents were sharecroppers. But she felt compelled in that moment to act. And I think that being there with Justin as well, being able to kind of get into that interview with her, it transformed our relationship. And actually, I work now at Emory University, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. So I was able to go home not too long ago, and I actually played that oral history interview with her again. Because, of course, our process is transcribed, it's recorded on a disc, and then sent to the person. So then seeing her hear herself, she was like, oh, my God, that's what I sound like? I can't believe that. But for 2 hours, we were, like, wrapped together. listening to what she had said, and it was just really, our relationship it was always strong, but I just felt a new connection with her through having done that interview with her. Yeah, I'm sorry, Roger.
For me, I think oral history and doing these interviews with people you do not know who aren't family, it was a wake-up call. And it was a hard lesson to learn. At my prior institution, I always had a professor who also worked with the slave narratives, Dr. Freddie Parker. He used to always say, y'all should talk to your grandparents. You should talk to your grandparents. And as a undergraduate, it's just flying over my head at the time. Your life is consumed, or you think with more important things, so you think. And I didn't understand until my grandmother died on my father's side. And we were sitting in her home, and we just started having all of these questions. And my aunts that were sitting there kept saying, your grandma knew the answer. And we were like, you all don't. Okay. And now I'm coming into my own, and I'm starting my master's, and now I'm understanding this process more, that I missed stories that I can never get back about my own family. Then you realize your family members can be the hardest people to actually interview and to sit down to get grandma to talk. Yes. Because I tried with my mother's mother. Grandma, I want to interview you. I ain't nobody. I don't have nothing to say. And I said, Grandma, I think you do have something to say. And at the time, it just happened to be around Christmas time, December. And my family members was there. And I was like, Grandma, I'm going to go get my recorder. You should talk. Oh, girl, don't do that. Come sit down and eat now. Time to eat. But once I did that, I walked away a little bit, went in the kitchen. And she was sitting at the table. And then she said, all my life, I worked for white folks. I cleaned their homes. I took care of their children. And she just started talking. And in that moment, it's like, okay, I can't run and get the recorder now. It's too late. It's too late, because at least I got her talking and sharing that story with her children and her grandchildren. And that was impactful, because 3 months later, she passed. But it was hearing that story to say, I knew something was there. I knew these photos of these kids that don't look like me, that you get every Christmas, and they grow. And they've gotten older just like I've gotten older, meant something to you, or there was a story behind it. Now it's my job to go find it and tell it.
I want to be fair, get people on this side. And
I have a comment, and it goes back to something that Justin said, but it's a commonality in my observation from what I heard the panelists say, is that the human spirit is powerful. And from all of the interviews, I think that resonated with me, that the human spirit truly is powerful, and it's very hard to defeat.
Thank you all for being here. I wish you would stay. I've thought a lot about this oral history process, because I believe I came up to Pew Hall for an interview one time. I don't know if anything ever happened. I didn't think it was very interesting. But I had never thought until recently that there could be a tougher side, a dark side to collecting histories. And I didn't until I saw it happen, where the city of Gainesville was trying to kick off the Heritage Trail project, had no clue what to do, but let a staffer jump up and say, oh, I'll bring somebody whom they brought from Canada. And that person came in and said, well, who's doing this? And they looked around and saw Arts and Medicine and saw the Proctor project, and sent that person just basically for a brush with each program, just to kind of take on their cloak, but not really connect with them. And that person went out and inserted additional consents, and what he was showing the people to give himself 100% ownership, turned immediately around and started monetizing that material. And city legal and a lot of people in the neighborhood, all kind of people got into trying to claw that back. But yet and still, just this past weekend, that same person is still doing a money-making production on that similar material. So how do you deal with making sure that those stories are properly honored? That if something happens to monetize them, there should be royalties back to the source.
I think you brought up a great point that speaks to the ethics of doing oral history that I had to learn myself, that I was introduced to when you're trying to launch an oral history project and actually do field work. And of course, my experience here in Florida comes with St. Augustine, Florida. And if anybody know about the history of St. Augustine, you know, it was a hotbed for civil rights in '64, you know, became this place where Dr. King, so the story goes, needed to simmer down a little bit to get the Civil Rights Act passed. And a lot of people, because marches were led, you know, King had came and actually lived on the street and walked the street that's actually named after him. Other civil rights leaders who've come to that town stayed in the community. A lot of people have come to collect the history, to talk to individuals who have housed them and have left, made documentaries, wrote books, and a lot of the individuals who have done the stories have no idea that a book is coming, a documentary is being made, and their story is going to be shared. So understanding that knowledge and having that background, when we launched our project for St. Augustine, we made it a commitment, a priority, #1 obligation to partner with the community and actually have a partnership that can be on paper, that's not just in theory but in practice. And we did that with the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center with Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, who are here. Our goal was not just to come in and collect these oral histories, but to keep them in the community from which they came. And through our work in collecting interviews, all the interviews that we have done are not just housed here at the University of Florida in the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, but you can find copies at the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. You can go in and listen to those interviews. The people who've given those interviews can go in and listen to it. And the great thing about it, it's public. Anyone and everyone can walk in to listen to these interviews that we have done through the Sam Proctor Oral History Project. Our goal is not to make money, at least my personal goal is not to make money off of people's stories, but to highlight them and share them and to change the narrative.
I think I would just want to echo what Roger was saying about partnerships, and I think it really does come down to you know, a person's kind of individual ethics. So I did a project with Cone Park Library to host an event for K through 6 kids on Emancipation Day and Juneteenth celebrations in Florida. And I actually received a grant from the Center for Public Humanities at UF to do it. And when I got the grant and did the budget, every dime was put back into Cone Park. So whether it was, we're going to print out 50 CDs of these audio and put these in the community for whoever wants to take them for free, that's what we're doing. When we do this event, we're going to have snacks for the kids because it's going to be after school. Like every dime that we got, it was important for it to be a real partnership and put it back into that community space. So whether it was snacks for kids, resources, any way that we could kind of purchase something, whether it was an iPad or any electronics to then give to Cone Park. I think it really has to be an ethical commitment to investing in the communities where these actual histories are coming from. But I think it also has to be a system in place where it can't be individuals, right? It has to be collectives of people who are holding each other accountable. So again, that we don't reproduce that kind of violence through exploitative practices of people's histories here. Hi, Nicole Dawkins. It's an ethics question, and this could be to anyone. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you are hearing someone's story and you're getting information that you feel like, well, wow, that's probably not something I want to share with the rest of the world? And how do you deal with making that decision? Because personally in my life, when I did start asking questions of my family, because there's always one person in the family that will start asking the questions that nobody else wants to ask. And being from Jamaica, I have a very complicated, you don't know who is whose child, and we got into one of those situations where you're like, oh, that's not my real family member. Wow, that's who the real parent is? You know, this is a parent that everybody knows. They're in the media. They're in the news. Do we really want to share this information?
That's a very good question, and it has come up several times in interviews that we've done. One thing we do when we start every interview is to let people know that, look, if at any point you would like us to turn off the recorder, or if there's something you don't feel comfortable sharing, just let us know. And we shut that down, and we'll do that. There are times as well when we feel like this might be getting a little too intense, and we push pause on the recorder ourselves. Because we know that these interviews are public access. And as a result of honoring that public accessibility, we have to make it public. And then in one case, I've actually gone back and edited some of the audio after to take out after the interviewee's demand a piece. It was mainly around the issue of age, so it wasn't as heavy, but she was very protective about the world knowing how old she was because of her profession and everything, and so I cut that out. And quick question, what if it's
a crime? What if it was a crime? I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to offer any legal advice. But I will say, on that note, we have done interviews, because I was in St. Augustine, with individuals who have recalled situations that if someone in the criminal justice system heard might have a little more questions than I would have about this situation. And the process that we do have here at the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, I mean, not speaking directly to your situation, but interviews that we know are questionable or could open up quote-unquote cold cases. We have talked to the individual, we let them know that, hey, we're going to quote-unquote put this in our black archives, that for 25, 30, 50 years, this will not be released. But honoring public accessibility, it will be released come your death or once this time has expired. That's what we have done here.
We have time for one more question, and we'll have time for questions as the day goes on, too.
I think it would be remiss if I didn't tell the panel, thank you, but you have talked about St. Augustine so much that the bridge needs to be made here this morning to let you know that LaVon Wright, father, Reverend T.A. Wright, was in St. Augustine prior to coming to Gainesville and starting this process of integration back in the 60s. I went to elementary school and high school with Joel Buchanan. You all have done an oral history with my mom. She passed 2 years ago. She was 90 years old when you did the oral history. I have not heard it. It's laying next to my bed. I promise you, because of your presentation here this morning, I'll listen to it tonight.
Thank you.
we have unfortunately come to the end of this session. We'll have time because now you know who these amazing scholars are. You can question them, interrogate them one-on-one, turn the tables, if you will, interview them. But I would like to take the opportunity to thank each of them for their wonderful insights this morning. Let's give them a round of applause. And they've agreed to sit here, kind of bird in the cage, if you will, to answer any questions you may have. Now is the time we're going to take a coffee break. Again, we have books in the lobby. If you want to check out the amazing books out there, they're for sale. And please enjoy yourself, and we'll reconvene back here. We'll start 11:45 sharp. Okay, so we have time for a break and everything.